welcome everybody to the Sales and Marketing Director Incubator, the program that helps you make great career decisions to help you maximize your potential. My name is Mike Dixon, Director of the Sales, Marketing and Category Practice for AXR Recruitment and Search. And in each episode this year, we're focusing on a particular theme. In our last session, we talked with Andrew Sutherland, who's the Managing Director of Light Switch Consulting, about the move from corporate to consulting and how to make that move stick. And today we're talking to Yvette Costi, CMO of Bloom's the Chemist, council member of the Marketing Society, and author of a blog called Hire the Outsider, It's the Best Risk You'll Ever Take, which went really viral and was published in February issue of CMO magazine. And we'll use that to kind of as a backdrop for some of our conversation this today. So welcome, Yvette. How are you?
Thank you. Yeah, good to be here. I'm well, thank you, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Well, I'm really looking forward to this, Yvette. I really enjoyed your article when it came out. I was pointed to it by a couple of different people in the both in the marketing world and in the recruitment world, saying, Mike, you'll have some views and thoughts on this, but it did get some good traction. But before we get into that, we'll just as always, chat a little bit about getting to know you, Yvette, first of all, and I'm asking similar questions to each guest I have on this year, just to kind of gather the insights. So the first question I'm asking everybody is about your favorite brand. And the kind of caveat is that you can't pick a brand that you are either currently working on or previously worked on.
Yes, this is a great question. My first thought was actually something that I think one of your previous podcast guest shows, which was Who Gives a Crap. But when I had to go back to the drawing board, I actually thought of a particular brand that's really impressed me in the last few years, which is Mona, the Museum of Old and New Art down in Tasmania. And as a result, the tone that Mona has set, and then the tone that Tasmanian tourism has taken. So I love, and I've heard Robbie Bramwell speak. He's I think either the head of marketing or the CMO down at Mona, and that kind of subversive irreverence that Mona has as part of their brand identity just suffuses through everything they do. And I don't know if you've seen some of their recent out-of-home advertising, but they use their worst reviews on their billboards. So there was a guy, so for those of you that haven't been to Mona, they have a machine that's basically a digestive system, and at certain points of the day this machine actually poops. So this guy said, and I paraphrase here, and they've used it on the billboard, I spent X amount of dollars to watch a machine take a shit. And he gave them 1 star. And in true to their brand and true to that irreverence and that kind of subversive nature of the brand, and really not being afraid to be 100% confident and true to what they do, they use this chapter review on the billboard, which is just pure genius. So yeah, Robbie and what the team are doing down there at Mona is just superb.
I love that. That's really interesting. There's something about that brand that does just speak to Tasmania. And, I've got for example, a running friend coming over later this year to do some trail running. And he said, I really want to go to Tasmania. And I said, oh, any particular reason? He goes, well, I want to go to Mona. And, he's a guy who's English, but is currently living in, was in Canada, it's now in Denmark, and it's just the brand obviously carries. It's and it does. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and it's one of those brands that I think it is, and I say this to my team all the time, our brand has to be homogenous in the sense that if it's a cake, it's chocolate on the outside, it's chocolate on the inside, and it's chocolate right down to the bottom. And that, by that I mean, what does our brand stand for, and what are our brand codes, and what is it that our values are, and how do we stay true to those and use those as decision-making tools? And I think that's something they've done exceptionally well. Like the stuff in the gift shop is as weird and confronting and subversive as everything else that you will find in that museum, as well as their marketing, as well as the ferry that's kind of covered in camouflage, and the first class section is called the posh pit, not first class. And
Yeah.
they, every single way that you experience Mona is 100% true to those brand values. And I think it's a masterclass, really.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. Okay. So let's get into you and your career, Yvette. What do you do? Give me your elevator pitch.
Mm. So I'm not your everyday BAU CMO. I tend to come in to businesses and either build marketing functions or fix things. So that's kind of my point of difference. I don't like to do things that I've done before. I certainly am hired to do things I've done before, but I also have to, for me to find it a challenge, there has to be an element that is discovery and learning for me. So in my last role, I chanced upon a team of 12 people, and was given the task of building a full complement, full funnel, top of funnel through, to kind of advocacy responsibility, to build a team that kind of covered that full gamut. And the 12 people I inherited were bright and clever and wonderful humans, but had never actually worked as marketers in the truest sense of the word. So building a team, and that team was 32 people across 7 countries by the time I left, and we'd been through prepping the business for private sale. We'd been through 3 rounds of due diligence, all of these things that I'd never done before, and that for me was the exciting part of the role. And now at Blooms, I'm faced with similar prospects. So it's a very small team, but the business wants to see quite ambitious growth, especially in a sector that is very much dominated by two particular brands that the rest of the pharmacy industry finds really hard to penetrate, and it's a huge challenge. So that's kind of my sweet spot.
Great. Okay. Well, I'm sure we'll kind of get into how you think and how you approach things as a marketer and as a leader as we go through. That's the purpose of the conversation. But I really want to get into this article you wrote, Hire the Outsider. It's the best risk you'll ever take. You wrote that earlier this year. I think it was published in February. And for those who haven't read it, and I'm sure you'll get on the back of this a few more hits, but could you explain why you wrote it and what it's about?
Yeah, I mean, the reason I wrote it was out of sheer frustration, trying to find a job. So I'd been on maternity leave for 15 months and was in a position to be looking for a new job. And I decided that after a pretty long career in property and the built environment, I wanted to change industries. I didn't want to continue down that path. I wanted to flex some different muscles. And to me, the logical, at a CMO level, it seemed a logical, a prospect. I didn't think that it would be particularly difficult. And I spoke to a myriad of fabulous recruiters who gave me great feedback on my CV and my experience and me as a candidate, as an individual, but came up against, a level of skepticism around clients being open-minded to take me on from an industry that wasn't built environment and real estate. And I just kind of, it was a bit of a head scratcher. I just couldn't understand how. It's like saying to an accountant, a CFO, well, you couldn't possibly be a CFO of a retail business. You've only worked in X industry. And I'm sure CFOs get the exact same thing. I'm sure of it. But marketers have applicable skills. They've got transferable skills that can be picked up and dropped into absolutely any situation, so long as you have, all the foundations and a process and a good head for leadership. So yeah, I was frustrated, and I said to my husband, "I'm going to do something about this." And Nadia Cameron, who's the editor in chief at CMO Magazine, she and I had been talking about a couple of other things, and the Marketing Academy that I'm on the council for. We'd been talking about all sorts of opportunities to kind of get our alumni out and sharing their thoughts. And I thought, you know what, I've got nothing to lose. I'm just going to pitch it to Nadia and see what she says. And she was into it. So I thought, okay. So I wrote this article, and the content really is an ode to my frustration. at the beginning, I go through a list of things that I've been able to achieve in a career, and none of those things had anything to do with the industry that I was in. And the point I was making is I can learn your industry and your buzz terms in 2-3 weeks, less even. But what a CMO can't learn is the things that I've achieved in my life in a really short space of time. So if you're going to recruit based on industry and not actually based on skill set and ability to drive change and all of those sorts of things in your business, you as an organization are losing out. And I use a couple of key examples, one being Robert Pollett, who became the CEO of the Gucci Group. After a fairly long reign of I can't remember his predecessor, but during the Tom Ford era. And, people poo-pooed Robert Pollett because he came from frozen foods. I think that there was a headline that said the Iceman cometh, and really were quite dismissive of his ability to do anything for a luxury brand where the majority of leaders in luxury were either Italian or French. He was Dutch, couldn't speak French. He wanted to start in June, which is when everyone goes away on holiday. And there was a real level of skepticism about his ability to do the job. And he delivered results, hand over fist, because he came in with process and really, really great fundamentals and understood how to build brands. Absolutely, agnostic of what those brands were.
Great. We'll post a link to the article in the show notes, so those of you who are listening and haven't read it, jump on and I'll give you context to what we're going to talk about. So I suggest reading it perhaps before you press pause, go and read it, come back to the show. But now, Yvette, have you been able to challenge the norm in your career in terms of maybe a move or two you might have made where you persuaded an organization or a hiring manager to see you and hire you as the outsider?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of times actually, early on in my career, most certainly, and probably in my last 2 roles. So my current role, which I love, and I'm so glad that that it did take a little time to find it, because I am where I'm supposed to be, I think. I am CMO for Bloom's the Chemist, a pharmacy group, a retail pharmacy group that's in all states of, except for Tasmania, pardon me, across Australia nationally. And that really was down to the openness and willingness of Bloom's to take me on, was really down to, I think, the progressive nature of our current CMO, Emmanuel Vavulis, and also a recommendation from a fellow Marketing Academy alum. So for those of you who don't know what the Marketing Academy is and you are in the area of marketing, I thoroughly recommend that you do your research and figure out if you're at the right level to apply, because it's a career changing experience. And I went through the program in 2020, and part of my cohort was a wonderful human called Pamela Bishop, who is the Chief Operating Officer at Bloom's the Chemist. And when this role of CMO came up, she recommended me, and it was her faith in my ability to be able to take those skills that have been applied elsewhere and bring them to Bloom's and actually add perceived value to the organization. So that's the most recent. And then I think early on in my career, I didn't find it as hard, but also the early part of my career was in the UK, and I found organizations to be far more progressive about how they hired people out of organization. In fact, I worked for a property developer in the UK called Mount Anvil many years ago, and the mandate for any given team was do not hire within the property industry. And that really came from, again, a very progressive managing director who would just say, if I wanted to know what we already know, then I would hire within industry. But what I want to know is what we don't know. And I think I referenced that in the article. So unless your perspectives consistently, and perspective is like a camera aperture, it can be as tiny or as big as you allow it, and those perspectives will only increase in their size the more diversity of thinking and experience you get into your business.
You touched on a couple of things there. One is your time in the UK, and secondly was the perspective of the property sector
Mm,
in the UK, or particularly the business you're within. But having spent time in both markets, as I have too,
mm.
do you think this reticence to hire the outsider or to stay in a lane is an Australian thing, or is it more accentuated here compared to the UK, for instance, or both
Yeah.
markets similar?
Look, I think had we had this conversation pre-COVID, I would have said that the UK was far more progressive and open-minded. I think post-COVID, people's risk profiles have changed. And I say this referencing another alumni from the Marketing Academy who was in the hospitality travel industry here. And she had to move back to the UK because she was having such an issue finding a role within that same within that sector because it took such a hit during COVID, but B, a complete reticence to hire her out of category here. And she's had a similar experience in the UK. Now, I would say pre-COVID that wasn't my experience. That wasn't the case. But I think as world events change and pressure and costs of living and supply chains and all of those sorts of things become fundamental issues for businesses, that risk profile does decrease. So, and long story long, as I sometimes say, yeah, I found it much easier to move categories in the UK. But again, as I said, it was a different time. Post around 2008, it was near on impossible. You had the global financial crisis, and moving categories in the UK was really difficult because everyone from finance was now looking for a new job.
Hmm.
And for some reason, everybody wants someone that's had finance experience. And then that got increasingly easier and better over time. And I think they're probably feeling a similar sort of pinch right now.
Yeah, I'll come back to that piece on risk because I think it's worth delving into. But just to give some perspective, what does hiring the outsider do in your view? I mean, you
Mm,
alluded to it in terms of perhaps your CEO in property who said, if I want to understand property, I'll hire within property. But I
mhm,
kind of get that. But
mm,
what does hiring the outsider do in terms of the organizational, change, or
mm.
what impact does that outsider have?
Look, I think there's so many things. I talked about perspective earlier. We are all, and rightly so, very focused on increasing diversity, inclusion, and equity within businesses, and that's most certainly to give previously marginalized groups to a chance to be part of organizations and industries and professions that ordinarily they may not have had the opportunity to, and that's extremely important. In in tandem to that, I think we also have to think about diversity of experience. So when we talk about increasing diversity within our workforces, when we look at backgrounds, the reason why we do that is it's life experience, a diversity of life experience, a diversity of cultural influence can only serve to increase creativity, increase perspective, increase um, a breadth of thought, all of those sorts of really good things that everyone in an organization says we need this, and then does really very few things to put it in place. So when we're focusing on kind of cultural diversity, which, and I reiterate, is extremely important, the other part of that coin is diversity of thought and diversity of experience. And we talk about neurodiversity and all of these sorts of things. I think it's really important to actually include diversity of experience and the way people think as part of that broadening of perspective.
Yeah, and if you look at you specifically, Yvette, has the experience of being an outsider developed you as a marketer or as a leader?
Mm. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Every time you get to apply those skills that you have, you hone them. It's a process of honing. And it's also a process of understanding maybe the supply chain, or further down the supply chain, or further up the supply chain, or how all of these kinds of things interlink, because at the end of the day we all contribute to the same economy, we all contribute to the same society. So probably a really good example is my property experience has been really valuable in this role, because any retail business that looks at growing its brand needs to look at growing the number of stores that they have. Now, for me, property is not just about the bricks and mortar, but it's also being strategic about location. It's about understanding how cities grow, how communities function. And that's been a really important skill set for me to bring into this role. I have, strangely enough, have a background in interior design. And that's been extremely important in this, because we're looking at how we can increase our distinctiveness in store. Now, if I hadn't had had that really unusual set of skill sets to bring into this business, and I was a CMO that had been in retail and kind of just had a really retail focused career, again, the business would have missed out on those sets of experiences. So I think, you know, and I kind of answered your previous question in the same question, but the point that I suppose I'm getting to is that it's allowed me to bring those skills in, but see infinitely more applications for them and understand how to make those skills better. And actually, I think it probably makes me a better leader than it does a marketer, how to pass on those skills to people in my team so that they become really full, well-rounded marketers as well.
As a recruiter of many years, I've always found it really frustrating, the narrowness of so much decision making that goes on at an organizational level when it comes to hiring. And I think recently we've seen more evidence, more science, more examples of the power of diversity. And I think in Australia in particular, we focus a lot on gender in the past few years for a good reason. I think in my experience as a recruiter, I think there's the most obvious area that we struggle with in terms of diversity is age. I think ageism is much more acceptable for some reason, whereas I think most people, sane people, would really struggle to be around somebody who's being, I guess, sexist in one way or the other in their decision making. But it seems that age is one that we really struggle with, and I don't know why that is. It's often that comes alongside that as well. I'm looking for somebody with at the right stage in their career, and then kind of brackets is who's got more energy or whatever. And the reality is energy is a thing that's there's plenty of young people who've got no energy, plenty of old folks who've got lots of energy. So it's I don't think it's a very interesting one, isn't it? Diversity when you get into it as to why. I think, and this is not an Australian thing, I found this in all the markets I've recruited around the world, that age is a one that just people seem to be comfortable using as an excluder when it comes to recruitment. I don't know in terms of your experience whether is that something you've seen at all?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think any leader gets to a point in their career, and I would say this happened for me probably about 6 or 7 years ago, where you actually have to have a look at the people that you're hiring and have a bit of a talk to yourself that you're not hiring in your own image. And I think we all at some point do that, because they're the people that you kind of gel with and spark with, and you're it's why people procreate. You see yourself reflected in this tiny human, and that love is very much connected to ego. So I think it's a lesson I learned many years ago, that yes, you may have an affinity with people that have a similar personality type, and might be the similar age profile, might have the same interests as you outside of work. But actually what you're doing is you're then narrowing that perspective again. And I keep coming back to perspective, because it's the only way I can actually explain and make sense of why diversity is so important, why hiring people with different skill sets and experiences are important, and all of those sorts of things that we're discussing here. It all culminates in your organization being able to represent the society that you actually operate in to the most, I think, to the broadest degree. And that's what it is, because most of the brands that, that we're talking about, Blooms most certainly, I think our population is hovering around 24 million. Our mass market is 24 million. Every single Australian is a possible Blooms customer. Everybody needs pharmacies. Whether you're old enough to transact over the counter or not, you are potentially a patient. Babies as young as a week old may need prescriptions, and people right at the tail end of their lives do too. So, in order for us to best serve communities that we want to speak to, and actually, shape our offering and our brand to be appropriate for that, we actually have to have the most diverse perspective that represents those communities. And obviously we can't, in an organization with X amount of people, you can't represent every single different, type of Australian. But what you can do is make sure that you have people that have an affinity, or at least some level of experience in dealing with as much of that amazing kind of patchwork quilt as possible.
Yeah. Affinity bias is an interesting one. Is that the main reason why so many recruitment decision makers stay in their lane, or is there more? Is there more to it than that?
Look, I definitely think there's more to it than that. I think when you get down to, a short list of candidates, you can fall into the trap of affinity bias, most certainly. And like I said, I have, and it's something that I learnt to really scrutinize myself on. In fact, we went through a process most recently, and the person through the process I had a real affinity with. And to put a stopgap in, or to put kind of a sense check in there, I got that person to have an interview with somebody else as well, just to make sure that I wasn't blind to kind of skills gaps, or areas that I really should be very aware of. And I think that, the affinity bias is part of it, but I actually think that the majority of the reticence to hire out of category or not hire the outsider is all down to risk. It's reputation and risk, because at the end of the day, as the hiring manager, what you're doing is you're saying, okay, my business has towed this line for as long as, we've been an organization. I'm going to not toe the line. I'm going to make this decision. And unless you kind of have, I don't know, the guts to kind of back it up, or unless you're willing, or you work in I think the big thing is, do you work in an environment where risk taking is rewarded? Because we all fail. It's just whether, failures are treated as, enormous, issues where blame is attached, or whether it's a case of, okay, we tried that, it didn't work, we know that, we learnt, how do we move on? So I think that reticence to hire the outsider is very much down to risk profile and personal decision making, and people just not being willing to put their reputations on the line in order to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. There's lots in this, the whole
Mhm.
concept of influence decision making in talent attraction and recruitment. Affinity bias being part of it.
Mm.
But it's a very interesting point you make around risk.
Mm.
Most organizations, barring very few, would claim to be completely risk adverse, because otherwise they're really going to struggle to
Mm.
develop themselves in any shape or form going forward. So there's a degree of risk taking in any organization, some more overt than others. But often when it comes to recruitment, as somebody who lives and breathes that every day, there's a real conservatism around the decision making, and a safety
Mm.
in the knowledge of, and the comfort of having somebody that you know what you're getting, with someone who's either like you, or has comes from your sector, comes from your industry, or an adjacent industry or sector, one that's come
Mm.
close enough that you might think I'm taking a bit of a risk here, but the reality is you're not really. So I love to get into the role we all play in that. So maybe start with your kind of role as somebody who's hired and built teams of that. You said right at the start that part of your role is to, what you enjoy is going in and either fixing something that isn't quite there, or building capability within an organization from a marketer's point of view. So what's your experience when, as a leader, when it comes to hiring talent? Have you always had decision-making autonomy, or has that varied?
I think it's varied. Over the last probably 6 or 7 years, yes, I have. But again, in the role that I was in before Blooms, I had four line managers in 4 years, ranging from the CEO to a COO to a CRO to a regional managing director when, the people had come and gone and there was nowhere else to put me. And it really depended on the individual. Some of those line managers were more involved and had more of a micromanaging approach, and they were the ones that had the lower risk profile, and it was all connected with their own reputation. And then others that kind of just trusted me and said, crack on, find great people, hire them. The one thing I have learned is always involve key stakeholders in that individual's success in the hiring process. So whilst when I reported into the global CEO, he gave me his full trust, which was wonderful, but I wasn't going to hire this very high profile, very key role for my team without him at least having met that person. And whilst he didn't necessarily require me to do that, that was something I built in. So I think that there's a difference between having the be all and end all say, and then just involving people that are ultimately going to have a stake in that person's success. And you're not doing a new recruit any favors by hiring them clandestinely and not involving the people that are going to help them get to where they need to go. What you're actually doing is you're setting them up for failure. Even if that stakeholder is really tricky, better the person knows before they come on board with you in the organization, brief them, tell them how their role is going to interact with that person, and put them through that pass. Like, I think that's really important. And if you have a stakeholder that may not agree with you hiring that person, I wouldn't ever not hire because of that opinion, but I probably would start to work back and try and figure out why they were a detractor and how we can possibly mitigate some of those issues, particularly in the first 90 days of that person starting.
Yeah. So do you hire outsiders yourself as a hiring manager? You've done this, right?
Oh, always.
Great.
I mean, I don't go about it saying I have to hire an outsider.
Yeah.
I don't dismiss someone due to a lack of industry experience.
Sure. So you have this holistic view. So you talked there about looking to your key stakeholders and thinking, how do I involve them in the decision? So I'm not bringing this person in through the back door and landing them on in the first meeting. But have you been challenged particularly from either boss, HR, or peers in the past when you've hired someone and they've said, what are you doing? Or is the approach you use now something you've learned to do? Has it come through being challenged negatively in the past, or does that challenge still continue?
I think it's a mixture of both. Honestly, the managing director that I spoke about in that residential property organization back in the UK, it was him that really changed my mind around being focused on bringing in skill sets that your team doesn't currently have, and that usually coming hand in glove with an outsider. That also really coincided with a lack of talent within the residential marketing community in the UK. It was all the same CVs and all the same names that were always coming up. And, I'd either interviewed them for a previous role and they weren't successful, or I knew that they'd worked for someone else who wasn't overly impressed with what they were doing. And I think you get to a point where you're just like, well, I can't, if this talent pool is really small because I'm focusing only on people that have this exact experience, well, you've got no other choice but to look outside. And it was infinitely more successful for me. I mean, it was successful time and time and time again. When I was at Unispace, which is a global professional services firm that specializes in workplace, we hired a young woman that had come from not for profit. One of the most successful people in my team was a guy that had come from not for profit and agency side, worked for Leo Burnett. Um, had no experience in, commercial real estate in general, professional services, any of that. And yet, from the minute they walked through the door, they understood the challenge. They brought skill sets to understand that everything is underpinned by systems, people, and processes, figured out where we were failing at a systemic level on those three counts, and then looked at the strategy and put forward ways to actually solve it. And we were successful time and time and time again. So for me, the proof was in the pudding. I got to a point where I was forced. I was also given the advice, and I did it. Insofar as someone who's kind of kiboshed a new hire because they were outside of an industry, yeah, I've had raised eyebrows. Oh, but they don't have, such and such experience. Yes, but they have this, 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 and this. It's going to take them a while to learn our industry. Really? Is it?
Not so much. Not as
No,
much as you think.
no, really not.
Yeah,
Really
yeah.
not. If you've hired a bright person will pick it up within 2 to 3 weeks max.
By definition, their learning agility is pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. I wonder in this market, we've got some really acute talent shortages. Not across the market. We're still quieter at the senior end, but in that mid space, whether it's a senior brand manager or a national account manager or a category manager, everyone's after the same type of person, and we play very much in those worlds. So we're having a lot of fun in it, but we are pushing the boundaries a little bit on perspective and broadening the view on what the perfect candidate looks like, and hoping that as that view broadens and people do take more risks when it comes to hiring, that they'll find those risks pay off, and some of that legacy experience might remain around open-mindedness to hiring the outsider going forward. But talking about, I want to get your thoughts on recruitment as well, because you do talk about mixed experience with the recruitment industry in your blog and at the time, and perhaps give me your expectations first of all of a recruiter as a candidate, and then we'll flip it around to when you're a client too. But when you kind of go to recruiters as a candidate, you've done this throughout your career, I'm sure. What are you hoping for? What are you expecting?
Look, I think you have to make a distinction between a recruiter and a headhunter, or someone that actually works with clients to place people in an organization, the other way around. So I dealt with a mixture of both. I think from a recruitment point of view, the expectation is for me at a senior level is that we're going to have a good amount of communication. And you're going to be creative and thoughtful about taking my skill sets and figuring out how we can spin that. How can we market me to fit the jobs that I'm interested in? And look, believe you me, the one thing marketers are horrendous at is marketing ourselves. So, my CV before I worked with a CV specialist was, if I had gotten it, I would, or if there was a billboard version of it, it certainly wouldn't be Mona worthy, like snore, move on next. So I think the first thing is any advice would be work with a CV specialist, get someone, because it's really hard to toot your own horn, right? So, and a recruiter can only work with what they're given. Otherwise, they're spending all their time trying to eke out that good stuff and those stories out of you. So if you can get that really sorted before you even start speaking to a recruiter, that's great. And then once you give that to the recruiter, working in a really in a partnership to try and figure out, okay, these are the things I've done, these are my skill sets, these are the kind of roles I'm after. How do we bridge the gap? I mean, it's marketing 101, right? This is the product, this is the target market. How do we bridge the gap? And that for me, particularly at a senior level, was the expectation. More search firms are obviously a little bit different. They have a suite of clients and a role comes in and they will actually, I had to learn the difference between the two. Because to be fair, most of my roles have materialized fairly organically. Even the one I'm in now did at the end of the day, even though I went through a kind of a more traditional search process before I got there. So, and when I mentioned recruiters in the article, I think, you know, the thing that really put me off were those that said, "Oh, no, you don't have industry experience next." And that was really hard. It was probably necessary for me to hear to kick me into gear to write the article, which then, you know, had some really positive effects for me as you know, a CMO in my career. But yeah, you know, I'm creative in my job. I try to do my job to the absolute nth degree, and that is sell a product to a target market or sell a service to a target market. I suppose I expected the exact same thing on the other end when I was speaking to you know, a recruiter or even those in search firms. How do you bridge the gap between what I've got and the job that I want, and make it stick?
Yeah, you know, with my recruiter's hat on, I think, like in any industry, there's a variety of people out there who operate to different levels, right? You know, but most broadly follow the same process. They're paid by a client to find somebody for their role, whether they're uh, you know, specifically working on a search brief or not. The process is remarkably similar, headhunter or recruiter, but there are differences. You're absolutely right. Most recruiters will spend you know, a fair bit of time up front challenging their client, and pushing the client quite hard as to where their views have come from, you know, because often they're very entrenched, and it's like, "I lost Sally, get me Sally," or you know, "Bob's been promoted, I want another Bob," and it's the easy way out, you know, it's a safe way forward. um, but you know, a recruiter will challenge that as far as they can, but I wonder if they could do more.
Mm.
Now, in your perspective, and say you'll dealt with recruiters as a candidate, and you'll have no doubt dealt with recruiters as a client when you're hiring as well, Yvette. What obligation do recruiters have, or what more could recruiters do to drive and broaden this perspective, to open the
Mm.
mindset of the hiring decision maker to the outsider, to somebody who's going to change the way in which that team performs, hopefully for the better?
Hmm. That's a really good question, and probably not a question that all recruiters would ask or even be open to an answer to. So I'm glad you asked it. I think first and foremost, as you say, having been on both sides, it's about actually knowing what the benefits of being broader minded are. You know, at the end of the day, and I understand when a market is really hot and there are like 100 candidates per role, you just want to get a good person in, and it might be the right person, get them into the role and move on. I get that. And you know, you've only got so many hours in the day. You might be working on 3 times more briefs than you normally would. And I understand in a market like that, it's really hard. But I think one of the things that recruiters can do for clients is actually take them through a process of, you know, are you investing in diversity? What's the purpose of you investing in diversity? You know, and if and some people will be investing in diversity as a tick box. And my assumption is that those organizations probably wouldn't be open to having a conversation around diversity of experience. Or if they are, it might be a bit of a harder task. But if an organization says, well, we want to increase, you know, perspective, or we want to increase creativity, and we've read all of these studies about how having a broader range of people with cultural backgrounds and you know, viewpoints increases, you know, team culture and creativity and output and all of these sorts of things. Well, then you kind of have your argument there to be able to say, so does diversity of experience. And I think there are two sentences from that article that I believe are really will hit home quite hard, which is, if you wanted to know what you already know, then hire within your category. If you want to know something different, if you want to know something new, if you want to learn from brands that are at the top of their game from a different category, then hire an outsider. At the end of the day, why wouldn't you try and shoot to get the person, like the leader or the individual from the number one brand in another category, as opposed to someone that's like, especially if you're number one in your category as well.
Mm.
Why hire from like the number five? What are you going to learn?
Yeah,
So
how the number five thinks. Yeah.
yeah, do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and it's so I think it's having those compelling arguments that actually have, like anything, well, especially if you're having conversations with C-suites, or anybody that has, again, diversity of thought, because often
Hmm.
CEOs are very numbers oriented, very process driven, very data driven. Just using the data. Know who you're speaking to. Know if you're speaking to an HR person, that's going to come from probably a more emotional point of view, a more human centric point of view. Well, if you want to increase team culture, if you want to increase diversity of thought, then this is a really good way to do it.
Yeah.
There's a really interesting book called The Loudest Duck, and it's actually based around the Western kind of Western cultures being so obsessed with alpha personalities, and consistently everyone wants to hire someone that's peppy and perky and really charismatic and can present and can influence, and I'm guilty of putting all of those things into job descriptions. But actually, at the end of the day, you need to have diversity of like neurodiversity, personality diversity. Like the more difference you can have in a team, the better the results you're going to get. So I think using data and numbers is really important, and examples. I would be happy if you ever had a client that wanted to know what it's like to hire an outsider and the benefits of bringing that outsider. And I'd be happy to speak to a client to say, okay, this was my experience. This is what I've been able to bring to an organization where I'd never worked in the industry before. You know, Progressive CEOs probably would be quite happy to speak to clients about that too. So.
Well, it's interesting. I know a lot of recruiters actually listen to this podcast as well, which I find very flattering. But that's lovely, lovely that they do. But my take is, if I think of when I interview people on the cusp of senior leadership, and it's not just, and it's all, but perhaps those in senior leadership as well, they often try to demonstrate their technical proficiency to me, how good they are running a function or their team or their division. And what they struggle with, unless I really prompt them and drive them and help them to this point, is how do they connect everything they're doing to the business objective, to the corporate objectives, to the strategy of the organization, and to see their team as that ELT as opposed to the team of people that are working for them. And it's a different point of view. And I think it's incumbent on recruiters to actually take it a step back as well and help the hiring manager think of what they're trying to do in terms of overall business goals, not just what they're trying to achieve that month, that quarter, that year for their business plan or their brand plan, but to actually think, what are we trying to achieve as an overall business, and how are we building capability in a sustainable way that's going to get us there. So I can actually look my CEO or board and square in the eye and say, this is what I'm doing. This is how I'm building my capability. So I think we have to be more directive as recruiters, less order takers, and actually help broaden the perspective and thinking of the hiring manager as well. But and I think I love your point there on how to use data, but layering that data back to the strategy, I think would be a really useful way of doing it. And we're conscious of time. I want to just move on towards the end about thinking of the listeners, Yvette, and what advice we might want to give those who are listening in, thinking, that's great. I want to be that outsider. I want to change the lane. I want to challenge myself and get uncomfortable, do something new. That's the way my mind is thinking. And I feel quite inspired by Yvette. So do they need to go backwards or to go forwards? Do they need to bear some of that risk as well, or is it all on the employer?
Look, again, interesting question. I was pretty uncompromising. I knew, well, after a bit of soul searching, I backed myself and was fairly uncompromising in my move. But that's not to say that might be what you have to do, particularly if you're kind of midway through your career. I think one of the best things you can do is actually speak to people that currently are in the industry you want to segue into. So find mentors, use your network to be connected to somebody. So if you want to move into finance and someone who works at CBA, then get an introduction and meet for a coffee. Like, have coffees, speak to as many people as you can, understand, demonstrate an interest in the industry that you want to move into. I think is probably the primary thing. And then really start to think like a marketer about yourself. I think that that's fundamental. If you've got a recruiter that's done the hard yards and got you to an interview stage for a job that's out of industry, and you haven't had those conversations and you haven't done that research, and you don't know that you're going to for an e-commerce role, and you're not up on how Google algorithms are going to work, and you don't have a view on a cookieless future, then you're not holding up your end of the bargain either. So there's work that you need to do yourself in order to demonstrate that you're up for the challenge, and that learning starts as soon as you make the decision that you want to segue into that particular industry.
Great. I'd encourage listeners as well to jump back on a previous podcast I did with Robbie Lawson, who's at Google. Robbie talked about the transition from the world of FMCG to Google, and how others have approached Google from different sectors. And some great content in there just backs up what you were saying, Yvette, around, you can't just rock up and expect them to say, okay. You've got to have a proposition that makes sense. Where's the value for them, as opposed to just the fact you want to change. So I think really worthwhile, guys. And we'll put the link to that in the show notes as well. But final question, Yvette, what does your future career look like? And I'm going to ask us in two-part questions. So first of all, with absolutely no affinity or bias in the market, you can go wherever you want. And then secondly, does that change in the real world where there is bias?
Oh, wow. So yes, I think whatever your aspirations are. I mean, look, I wanted to move into retail. Because I am probably one of the finest consumers the world has ever seen. And I love the human behavioral element that is so immediate with retail. And some of the brands I admire the most are retail brands like, Net-a-Porter, Lego. Some of these brands that just show time and time again that they understand who they are, and what it is that their customers want, and how they serve that up time and time again. I would like to think that my aspirations, I'm putting steps in place now in order for them to be fulfilled. I wouldn't take off the table that working in a different country, a different market, isn't on the cards for me or us as a family. And also, I really would love to run my own business. So I think for me, my career moves have never been particularly strategic, always very opportunistic. But this one move for me was the strategic move that almost I wanted to future-proof, say, the next 10 years should A, I'm not going to business for myself, and B, wanted to be in an area that really interested me. So you probably wanted something more specific than that, but I think, for me, it's about, I really do make decisions based on what I've enjoyed in the most recent role. And I think, that remains to be seen at Blooms. I've been there 3.5 months now. So what comes next for me, I would like to think I'm putting those foundations in now by having moved sector, and that would be possible in a real world environment.
Well, I love what you said at the start around, I think you said you're in the place you need to be at the moment, which is great. Yeah. So I'm pleased to hear that, and I wish you all the best with Blooms and the future. But in wrapping up, Yvette, really enjoyed the conversation. I feel there's a lot more we probably could have got into, but I think it's given, I hope everybody, all the podcast listeners, some really good food for thought and insights into what I think is a wonderfully interesting topic that's going to be ever evolving. And one of the overarching themes we have around this whole program now over the last sort of 45 of those sessions that we've done is don't just stay in that lane of yours. You need, if you're actually going to reach senior leadership in any shape or form, you've got to actually challenge yourself and give yourself organizational breadth, category breadth, sector breadth, geographical breadth, things that are going to give you perspective that enables you to think like a leader. So I think this just adds a huge amount of value to that kind of that thought vein we've been trying to mine for the last couple of years. So thank you very, very much indeed. Now, guys, next up on the live sales and marketing incubator, actually in a couple of days' time, is Elise Berryman. She's a general manager and founder of a business called Liquify Health, and it was a spin-out business from Pharmacare, the Nature's Way and other brands business. We're recording her episode on the 26th. If you want to jump on the live session, I'll be in the podcast the week after, Your Future in Sales and Marketing, as you know, because you're listening to it right now. Now, finally, I plugged our 2022 salary guides on the last pod. We've had a huge uptake on those, both for sales, for marketing, category, and insights. There's a lot of great content. We also do some super link backs to some of the content on the pod and incubator. We were making a particular point about talent or skill development, and it's not just our view, it's a view of a CMO or a reputable MD. So some great content on that. We've also just launched another new thing this week called the Sales and Marketing Collective, which is going to be a bi-monthly publication on who's moved where, how, and why, and so keeping in track. There's a lot that's going to LinkedIn. Sometimes you miss some of the moves, who's gone where. We don't worry, we're keeping a track of them. We're not placing everybody, but there'll be a number of our placements in there as well, but it's a holistic view of the market, so that'll be hitting your inbox soon as well. Thank you again, Yvette. That was awesome.
Pleasure. Yeah, really enjoyed it. And if anybody listening wants to reach out by LinkedIn, feel free. I'm happy to impart advice and give people contacts where needs be.
You will get a lot of requests, I am sure. So guys, that's awesome. Thanks for listening. See you next in Your Future in Sales and Marketing. Have a great day.